Good evening, everybody, and welcome once again to another lecture in the Remembering and Forgetting series of London lectures brought to you by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor James Wilson, who is a Professor of Philosophy at UCL. He is also the co-director of the UCL Centre for Health Humanities and a member of the National Data Guardians panel, extremely important role these days. He's written on a number of problems in practical ethics, including the ethics of pandemic response, the ethics of the use of health data, and the ethics of precision medicine. And his book, Philosophy for Public Health and Public Policy, came out with OUP in 2021. And his talk this evening is called Who Should We Remember and For How Long? Justice in Public Commemoration. James, over to you.
It's a great pleasure to be here. So this talk addresses one of the most difficult and politically contentious questions about memory and forgetting. What, who, and for how long individuals, events, and social movements should receive the spotlight of public remembrance through features such as public rituals, dedicated national memorial days, statues, placement within school history curricula, and a place within national narratives. It's a very broad topic that I'll be talking about today. So what I'll say is going to be inevitably rather programmatic. I aim to provide you with an orientation with which to understand what's at stake in some of these questions and how to go about weighing up what we should say about them, rather than to give you anything like an algorithm which would allow you to say anything definitive about, for example, what should go on the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square, or how we should resolve differences of opinion about parades in Northern Ireland. So the main novel move that I want to make in this paper is to frame the question of public remembrance as a question of justice within political philosophy, rather than, as it's much more often discussed, a question within memory studies. If I'm right that framing public remembrance as a problem of justice is illuminating, then questions about public remembrance can and should be opened up to the same kinds of arguments about specification and weighing of claims that we see in other domains of justice. So I'm going to suggest that thinking of public remembrance as a problem of justice poses some hope of making progress on what have been almost ridiculously contested questions of public policy. And I'm encouraged by the fact that there's some other domains of justice that we can think of that I worked in, say the allocation of scarce medical resources, where framing them as a problem of justice has allowed us to make progress even on questions that are incredibly contentious that involve life and death decisions. So I'll begin the paper by arguing that we should see public remembrance as what he described as a ritualized practice of memory, and I'll explain what I mean by that shortly. I'll then make the case that public remembrance does indeed pose problems of justice, and examine the question of if public remembrance raises questions of justice, who is it who has a direct stake in deciding on those questions? Do the stakeholders include the dead themselves, or is it just the living? And I'll consider also the extent to which communities ought to have some form of autonomy in deciding what they remember and how. So, and lastly, I'll clarify some of the ways in which stakeholders can be wronged by lack of remembrance or by inappropriate remembrance. And I'll close by making some programmatic and, I suspect, probably quite disappointing comments about how to reconcile the different interests of the relevant stakeholders. So, remembrance involves one or more individuals doing something deliberate and at least partly ritualized to bring to mind in an emotionally salient way one or more persons or events. So, remembrance has three elements that I'll comment on. The first, that it's a practice of memory. Second, that it involves ritualization. And third, that it focuses on emotional connection rather than strict accuracy. I'll suggest that remembrance has rather different goals from history, and I'll discuss each of these points in turn. So it's standard to distinguish between experiential and testimonial memory. So Experiential memory is the memory we have of embodied experiences that we've had. For example, the time I broke my leg, or that time I gave a speech at my sister's wedding. In testimonial memory, what's remembered is other people's accounts of events that have happened. And so that the testimony that we rely on when we have a moment of testimonial memory may itself be based on other people's first-hand experience, or it might be that their experience was itself second-hand, they got it from a book, or it's told them by a friend of a friend, and so on. So testimonial memory often includes events at which I was not or could not have been personally present for, so that, if I think about what I know about Henry VIII, I've maybe learnt it all through history books, or maybe even watching TV programs. And sometimes we do learn through testimony about events that we've lived through ourselves. You think about what your earliest memories are like, how to distinguish what's actually your memory versus what your parents have told you about what you did on your second or your third birthday. In other cases, it may be that you rediscover an old diary and you remember what it was like to be 15 or something of that sort, and you're reminded of a whole set of experiences that you've kind of completely put out of your mind for a long time. Maybe it seemed like a slightly different person had written those memories. Now, the big challenge is that recalling and retelling memories, whether experiential or testimonial, changes those memories. And after perhaps decades of retelling, it often becomes impossible, or at least difficult, to disentangle what was actually experienced or what was actually said at a particular time from what's now taken by us to have been experienced or said. As a result, it may become less than clear which elements of the memories we take to be experiential are in fact experiential, and which elements are based on testimony, and which elements are just based on a kind of confabulation. So the malleability and the fragility of memories, whether those memories are experiential or testimonial, is, I think, one of the main reasons why we have practices of remembrance in the first place. And I take it that remembrance is a kind of practice of memory. It gives memory an externalized and objective correlate, which makes salient and solid what's brought to mind. For example, by taking part in a Remembrance Sunday service, by putting your wreath alongside the others, you feel in contact with maybe relatives or those who fought for your country sometime before. Or in going to a Holocaust memorial, you might cement various experiences or a piece of knowledge or experience maybe quite so dear to you, or those who've been lost from your family. And in doing so, you're sort of remembering, you're bringing things to mind, you're reaffirming their importance, and so on. So, in short, remembrance involves much more than the mere availability of information or the simple bringing to mind facts or past events. So, if you take something like the National Archives we have here in the UK, then the National Archives themselves aren't cases of remembrance, though there may be ways in which the availability of archival information makes possible practices of remembrance. And there are all sorts of other ways in which mere remembering is not a case of remembrance in my case. So if I'm in a pub quiz and somebody says, what's the capital of Liberia? If it pops into my head, oh, it's Monrovia, again, it's not a case of remembrance in the way that I'm interested in today. That's just ordinary remembering. So importantly, remembrance may or may not be undertaken for any particular event. So that we'll just see a sort of mixed economy, so that we might have one and the same event that might be a matter of highly ritualized remembrance for some people, of experiential memory for others, testimonial memory for still other people, and simply unknown to lots of other people. So remembrance is a practice of memory which always involves ritualization. And ritualization is a process by which actions, objects, or events are made special for some group. As ritualization is a process, it's better understood as a continuum than a binary with sharp boundaries. And so I guess the closest to a sort of consensus definition you can get about what how ritualization occurs is in work of Ronald Grimes. His account of ritualization is well established within the ritual studies literature. And he suggests that there's a wide variety of ways in which actions or activities can become ritualized. For example, traditionalizing them by claiming they originated a long time ago, or elevating them, associating with sacredly held values, repeating them over and over in the same way, thus inscribing them in community or self, singularizing them, offering them as a rare or even one-time events, prescribing their details so they're performed in the proper way, stylizing them so they're carried out with flair, entering them with a non-ordinary attitude, with a special state of mind, for example, contemplatively or in a state of trance, invoking powers to whom respect or reverence is due, gods, royalty and spirits, for example, situating them in special times or places. And I take it that most of our most prominent cases of remembrance are ritualized along multiple of these dimensions. So you think of Remembrance Sunday, it occurs at a particular time of the year that the highlight of the ceremony is a particular set of individuals, high-ranking politicians, plus the king, going to a particular location, the cenotaph performing a set of actions involving laying of wreaths where other people take part in the activity which occurs in pretty much the same way every single year. And so remembrance is always ritualized, in my opinion. And so I think it's undeniably the case that ritualization makes actions more memorable and more emotionally resonant. And oddly, it's often the case that what we remember and what changes about a ritualized activity is the ritualization itself rather than the ostensible goal of it, which I think is an interesting and paradoxical feature of ritual. Now, one salient difference between ritualized activities and ordinary activities or routines is that actions which are ritualized are usually actions which are not ritualized are usually causally transparent. That's to say, outside of the context of ritual, those involved in an activity usually have a fairly clear idea of what they're doing, what the relationship is between the different aspects of their action and their end goal. But this tends to contrast quite deeply with actions that are undertaken as part of a ritual, as Dimitris Xygalatas puts it in a recent book on ritual. By their very nature, rituals are causally opaque. There's no obvious connection between the specific actions they involve and their purported end goal. Many rituals are also goal-demoted, lacking an external goal altogether. Performing the rite is the goal itself. But even if the goal of a ritual is known, its content cannot be inferred or predicted on the basis of that goal. A purification ritual may require pouring water, sprinkling salt, smearing dirt, burning incense, blowing in the wind, for Bob Dylan, ringing a bell, chanting, or any of a myriad of symbolic actions. To an observer, it's unclear how these actions might bring about purity. This gap between behaviour, intention, and outcome is why rituals often seem so puzzling, pointless, or even comical to outsiders. As Xygalatas goes on to point out, this causal opacity doesn't seem to be a contingent feature of ritual that we could remove and improve it as a ritual. Rather, this causal opacity, as he says, is essential to ritual's ability to create special and meaningful experiences. So, in short, ritual characteristically involves certain prescribed actions, and these actions bring something further to presence, but by its nature, it's somewhat mysterious how it does this. Even those who are participants in ritual frequently cannot explain, even to themselves, why each element of the ritual has the form it does, and which elements of the ritual could be changed or substituted without losing anything important about it. Nonetheless, as the result of the making special that's characteristic of ritual, it makes the prescribed acts emotionally charged, and the necessity of performing the ritual is usually felt deeply. I think that one of the implications is it's phenomenally difficult to argue rationally about ritual, the kind of activities that seem so important to undertake from the perspective of the participants, And they may think that they're so important they need to continue to be undertaken, even if they cause profound offence to others, even if they cause harm to those not involved in the ritual. So from the perspective of those undertaking the ritual, it's so important that everything is done in the precise way that it's easy to become somewhat blind to profound offence or harm that's caused by the ritual. It's difficult to argue that through and think about the way a ritual might be changed, insofar as even those undertaking the ritual are often not fully clear about how it works, why it does what it does. That's part of what it is that makes it a ritual. So all remembrance, I argued, is ritualized, but it's important to notice that remembrance occurs at different scales and with different expectations of publicity and officialness. So some acts of remembrance are undertaken by individuals in private. For example, a ceremony that two siblings undertake every year to honour their dead parent. Sometimes remembrance can take part on a larger scale with greater expectations of publicity, but will still fall short of being a fully public activity. Think, for example, about a memorial service held for a beloved head teacher at a school. And I guess in some ways, the kind of reflection on its nature, purpose, history that the Royal Institute of Philosophy is doing in its 100th year has involved a certain kind of remembrance, perhaps of ritualization of its idea as an organisation. We might come back to that or talk about it later. But finally, there are acts of remembrance which are performed by or on behalf of state institutions as public acts. So I take prominent examples of public remembrance to be things like Independence Day celebrations, Remembrance Day services, or the state-sponsored erection of a prominent public statue to honour a particular individual. So these are the kind of activities I'm going to talk about as public remembrance. So public remembrance is, among other things, a way of enacting a narrative about who we are by selecting and ritualizing a particular interpretation of the persons or events commemorated. It often functions to strengthen bonds of affiliation between individual citizens or between citizens and the state. But it can also be a powerful source of alienation or shame, where what is selected for remembrance and the stories told about it reinforce a narrow, false, or divisive conception of who we are. And of course, remembrance activities can shift along this continuum of private to public, for example, by becoming a fully state-backed public remembrance where there's previously been something sort of unofficial. So that's what happened with with Anti-Slavery Day in the past 15 years. Following an act of Parliament, it was decreed that the Secretary of State shall, by order made by statutory instrument, specify a date which shall be observed each year as Anti-Slavery Day. In other cases, the state may withdraw over time from officially supporting particular remembrance events, but these continue in unofficial forms thereafter. So, in doing my research for this, I discovered, in fact, there's a 1605 Act of Parliament called the Observance of the 5th of November Act 1605, which required that all should attend church on the appointed day and be read the text of the Act in order to express their communal gratitude that the gunpowder plot had been foiled. Apparently, the Act was not repealed until 1859. So we've seen that remembrance is a ritualized practice of memory. So this element of ritualization serves both to increase the emotional temperature and the significance of the events that are the subjects of remembrance. As a result, the goals of remembrance diverge significantly from those of history. Acts of remembrance can be effective as remembrance without the interpretation or narrative that's presented via their ritualization being either accurate or representative. Thus, a remembrance ceremony can celebrate the victories of a country in war while overlooking the atrocities the country was responsible for, but can still succeed as remembrance insofar as it creates a resonant, memorable and persuasive experience which cements a particular interpretation of the past. Conversely, historical scholarship aims at an accurate interpretation of and accounting for the past. I think it's always a legitimate criticism of a piece of historical scholarship if it gets the facts wrong, or if it doesn't take relevant information into account in its explanation of what happened and why. So I think there's quite a deep tension between the practice of history and that of remembrance. So historical scholarship tends towards accounts of past events that are complex, rich, nuanced, and through which the pastness of the past may emerge as strange and unfamiliar, rather than providing easy parallels or lessons. Remembrance tends towards smooth and clean stories, which, while directed towards the past, are often shaped more by the perceived needs of the present than by what those individuals who are ostensibly being commemorated would actually have wanted. And remembrance practices also unfold over time. What may begin as a simple ceremony to remember some initial event will itself tend to become institutionalized over time as levels of ritualization within it increase. Remembrance thus may increasingly depart from the experiential and testimonial memory of the events or persons commemorated, become its own sort of sui generis, making special. And as connections to experiential memory or to first-hand knowledge become weaker, remembrance may become completely unmoored from what it's ostensibly trying to bring to mind. One implication is that, just like the events themselves that are being commemorated, the history of remembrance may itself tend to become simplified into smooth and clean stories that serve the needs of the present. One implication of this is that there may be a kind of inflation in what's publicly prescribed by a particular ritualization. But the fact that such an inflation has occurred may be obscured both by the opacity of ritual and the emotional importance that participants of the ritual place on performing it correctly. To take one small example of this, the past 20 years have seen a very decided inflation in the ritualization and enforcement of poppy wearing in the lead up to Remembrance Sunday. Now, the first time that football teams wore a poppy badge was the match between Leicester City and Blackburn Rovers in 2003. And the practice spread after that, fanned on by parts of the press, including the Daily Mail. And as a recent Guardian long read takes up the story, over the next few years, the Premier League granted permission to any club that wanted to wear poppies, but didn't impose rules about whether they should. That would come later. Within a few years, as the presence of poppies on football shirt was enforced ever more hawkishly by the press and politicians, it would be hard to remember that for 82 years, no football team had played with poppies on their shirts, and absolutely no one had suggested that there was any problem with this. There's a sort of comedy element to this, but there's a kind of serious side to it as well, because those footballers who refuse to participate, even those who have conscientious reasons for refusing to participate, now find themselves targeted with abuse and perhaps even death threats. Now, I think this case of poppy inflation suggests a number of ethical issues posed by public commemoration, including self-righteousness, enforcing participation in rituals that some find uncomfortable or even unconscionable, claiming that particular behaviours are necessary as a mark of respect to individuals who would not themselves have thought those behaviours necessary. So I now want to make the case that not only does public remembrance raise ethical questions, but it's that these ethical questions should be fruitfully understood through the lens of justice. So next part of the talk aims to make the case that we should see public remembrance as a problem of justice. I try to do this in two ways. Firstly, by arguing that public remembrance fits a profile of a scarcity and conflict that's characteristic of distributive justice claims. And second, I'm going to argue that public remembrance and public rituals more generally may involve various forms of relational injustice to the extent that they maybe instantiate what's come to be known as emotional imperialism or other forms of domination. So Hume argues that considerations of justice apply only where there's a moderate scarcity of a particular resource and where we have limited sympathy with the others who might want to lay claim to this resource. And Hume thought that where a good is abundant and everyone has as much of it as they could possibly want, without preventing others from doing the same, then there's no need for justice. So under ordinary circumstances, air is abundant in this sense, so we don't sort of think that any issues of justice arise from how much air that each of us is is breathing. But if you get locked in a submarine or trapped in a lift, then suddenly the amount that you breathe, how you breathe, may suddenly become a problem of justice which you hadn't seen before. And Hume suggests that questions of justice arise not only when resources are scarce, but also when people consider their interest or their group's interests to be separate from and not collapsible into those of others. I guess this is one reason why we don't typically think of our relationships to our families and friends in terms of justice, as we don't sort of accept that our relationships with them, our interests, are fundamentally antagonistic or potentially antagonistic in these sorts of ways. So I think there are many cases, such as the distribution of land, wealth, or power within a society, that squarely meet these circumstances of justice. So I guess the question for us is public remembrance a resource to which these sorts of circumstances of justice apply? So I think there's a strong reason for answering yes. First, public remembrance is a resource that's scarce. There are a very great number of notable individuals who've lived and important events that have happened, which could all be plausibly treated as worthy as public remembrance. However, there's only a very limited amount of public space, time, and attention. There are only so many statues that can be erected in public space, only a very limited number of events that can be memorialised publicly through rituals or incorporated into the school curriculum. And second, our limited sympathies and different interests clearly lead us to disagreements about who and what should be publicly celebrated. Well, I've already explained how through ritualization the events or individuals who are the objects of public remembrance are made special in contradiction from other events or individuals who are not made special in this way. And so public remembrance thus not only focuses on attention on certain individuals and events, but also tends to downgrade, in relative terms, the importance of other events and individuals that are neglected by it. So, in addition, I'll now consider there are reasons for thinking that some public remembrance can involve the unjust domination of marginalised groups by more powerful ones within a society. Where this is the case, decisions about who and what to publicly commemorate are not just a matter of fairly distributing benefits, but also of avoiding systemic harm. All of this is, of course, complicated by the fact that disrupting or forcing the alteration of a remembrance ritual may itself cause profound offence or even harm to those who participate in it. So public rituals, of which public remembrance are a key example, typically prescribe, whether implicitly or explicitly, particular emotional responses in addition to outward actions. Thus, not to be sad or to be sad in the wrong way at a remembrance event can be a cause for criticism. Archer and Matheson have recently introduced the concept of emotional imperialism as a way of understanding what's going on in cases where emotional regimes and forms of expression that are enforced by a powerful group are experienced by less powerful minorities as oppressive. On their account, emotional imperialism is a species of cultural imperialism, and cultural imperialism not only involves, as they say, quote, a powerful group imposing its culture on a less powerful group, but quote, a particular form of cultural domination in which the powerful establish their perspective as both right and normal, while all other cultural perspectives are categorized as inferior and abnormal. Emotional imperialism then, according to Archer and Matheson, is a form of cultural imperialism that involves emotional experience, that is characterized by a powerful group imposing aspects of its culture's emotional norms and standards on a less powerful group, whilst at the same time marking out the culture's emotional norms and standards as deviant and inferior. Of course, the causal opacity of ritual itself often makes it difficult to unpack and to discuss lucidly what kinds of emotional responses are called for through public ritual, whether anything important would be lost if participation in the ritual activity was made more obviously optional, rather than these responses being enforced through public pressure or shaming. As a result, whether any particular activity of public remembrance instantiates emotional imperialism is likely to be subject to significant disagreement between those who celebrate the ritual and those who feel oppressed by it. So, while enormous amounts have been written about social justice in general, both at the systemic level, sort of by rules and everyone who's followed or responded to them, and also about more specific questions such as the distribution of scarce, medical resources, and I've participated in some of these debates myself. Public commemoration has been largely absent from debates within Anglo-American political philosophy. So I think that working out a theory of justice for public commemoration is not going to be straightforward, as one of the things I've often argued for in my work is that philosophy doesn't work well and it takes a sort of high-level concept and merely attempts to apply it in a sort of cookie-cutter style way to a new domain of thinking. Rather, we need to do a deep dive and attend to the features that are special within a particular domain. That's one of the reasons why I spent so much time at the beginning of this talk talking about ritualization, its relationship to remembrance. Because what makes the case of public commemoration so different is that we see that we're talking about how to fairly distribute the state's support for ritualized activity, and that by the nature of that ritualized activity, it's quite difficult to unpack what it is and why, and people become very attached to doing that ritual activity in exactly the way that they think it should be done. So it's not an easy task that I've set myself, and I've been sort of maybe slightly disappointed I haven't got further in providing a full and plausible answer to my questions. But despite the difficulty of the terrain, I think it's really useful to make an attempt, as it will provide a way of reconceptualizing some elements of the culture wars that have otherwise become rather toxic and unfruitful. So the whole point of justice is that we need justice because of scarcity and conflict. Framing something as a problem of justice is often the first step to fairly reconciling or managing conflicting interest. Now, just distributions or solutions always lead to some claims being prioritized over others, and hence to some perceived losers and some perceived winners. But nonetheless, if a procedure instantiates justice rather than, for example, being the workings of arbitrary power, it's able to provide us kind of second-order reassurance even to those whose claims are not met. This is because everyone will be in a position to see that not all the claims that have some merit could be met, and some of those making claims needed to be disappointed. In these kind of cases, somebody may still be somewhat angry at the result, but it's not reasonable to be angry at the mere fact that their claims have not been met, given that not all the claims could be met. If their claim had been met in full, then someone else's claims would have needed to have been disappointed. I think the discussion then can move on to the more fruitful terrain of the comparative strength of the competing claims and the circumstances and how they can best be reconciled. And where the processes by which claims are prioritised is transparent, free of bias and directed towards the public good, then we may think it's perhaps unfortunate, but in no way unfair, that some claims are not met. I think last, recognising public remembrance as a problem of justice among stakeholders who are each other's moral equals, but have deep differences in how they understand who, what, and how events and people should be publicly commemorated, allows us to seek creative compromises with a clearer conscience. It's no longer have to be seen as a matter of sort of losing or caving in, but perhaps a way of finding a way of reaffirming shared values in a more inclusive way. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to try and make some basic and perhaps inconclusive moves that will allow us to get a better sense of what a theory of justice for public remembrance will look like. The first question, which I'll take up in the next section, is whose interests and claims matter for justice in public remembrance? So this section aims to examine two different questions about the stakeholders for public remembrance. First, do they include the dead themselves? And second, a question about the standards of appropriateness for public remembrance. Do the choices about which individuals or events to commemorate and how they're commemorated need to be justified impartially to the world in general, or can they legitimately be partial, expressing only a particular community's self-understanding? So, public remembrance by its nature is directed to the past. Even where a key element of the intention of public remembrance is to affect present or future behaviour, for example, by ensuring that a particular atrocity is never repeated, the events commemorated belong to the past, and very often the people commemorated are no longer alive. I think this means that there's two potential sets of interests in play in commemoration, which may be in conflict. There are those doing the public commemoration and those who are being commemorated. And of course, it's not difficult to think of cases where public remembrance is used to enforce or encourage actions that most of those individuals commemorated would not have wanted. Sometimes, as perhaps in the case of poppy inflation, it may be a matter of enforcing a behaviour in the name of respect for a particular group rather more zealously than the vast majority of members of that group would have felt necessary. In other cases, the disjuncture may be rather more severe. The memory of those who fell fighting for one specific defensive cause may be invoked to justify an aggressive expansionist war. In cases such as these, where the interests of the commemorator seem to come apart from the interests of the commemorated, there are several ways in which the currently living can protest. For example, pointing out the hypocrisy or the self-serving nature of the commemoration. But it's sometimes also argued that we should treat the dead as stakeholders in such debates, that if we get commemoration wrong, we may be wronging the dead themselves rather than just the living. I think as a result, it's important to distinguish between two types of potential justice-based considerations when undertaking public remembrance. First, doing justice to the dead, and second, doing justice to the living. According to views of commemoration that make justice towards the dead a consideration, those of you who are now dead can be wronged by either not being commemorated at all or being commemorated in the wrong way. Of course, such a view is also compatible with there also being ways in which wrongs may occur to living persons through inappropriate commemoration. As I'll go into to argue later, doing justice to the living will involve doing justice to them as individuals with identities that connect them deeply to past events. As a result, there are ways in which individuals can be wronged by failures to commemorate the dead, even if those individuals who are now dead can't themselves be harmed or wronged. So the next step of the debate is going to be a little bit metaphysically subtle, and it also touches on important questions about what public remembrance is for, and I can only really scratch the surface here. I'm going to suggest that even if we're tempted by the idea that posthumous harms, wrongs, and benefits can occur, we cannot take an uncritical attitude towards the interests of the dead. It's we, the living, who must decide what to celebrate and commemorate and what to allow to go silent. I'll further suggest that explaining the value that we should place on the dead in commemoration in terms of our relational our relations to them provides a more plausible account than assuming that there's a self-standing value to the interests of the dead for their own sake. Now, one of the most venerable arguments against the possibility of posthumous harm comes from the Epicurus, who, in aiming to dispel the fear of death, argues that death is nothing to us because good and evil consists in sensation, and death is the removal of sensation. In other words, it's only things that we can experience that are bad for us, and given that we cannot experience anything after we die, nothing can be good or bad for us after death. So if Epicurus is right about this, there's nothing that could make a difference to the lives of people we admire or hate after their death. So it can't be the case that the dead can be harmed or wronged by being inappropriately commemorated. Now, many philosophers reject Epicurus's fundamental assumption, namely that it's only what we in fact experience that's good or bad for us. As Thomas Nagel pointed out in the classic article, Epicurus's view seems to have some rather counterintuitive implications. While it may be a common phrase that what you don't know can't hurt you, few of us in fact believe this. We do often think that things that can be we do often think that things can be good or bad for us, even though we're unaware of them. Being betrayed or laughed at or being subjected to an unnecessary risk may all be bad for us, even if these do not impinge in any way on our consciousness. Now, while this all seems very plausible while we're alive, it's nonetheless much less clear whether things remain capable of being good or bad for the individual once that individual is no longer capable of experiencing anything at all, i.e. once they're dead, once there's no longer a living subject. So Martin Wilkinson provides what's probably the best account of how individuals could be harmed or benefited after their deaths. On Wilkinson's view, even though dead people cannot experience things now, they can still be harmed or benefited now insofar as events in the world further or undermine their interests or projects. So if somebody campaigned tirelessly for a new park to be built in their neighbourhood during their lifetime, they could be benefited by the council's decision after their death to build the park, even though the individuals themselves would never be able to enjoy the swings. Similarly, somebody could be harmed long after their death, according to Wilkinson, if, for example, the case of one of the bog bodies, where 2,000 years on, a body is recovered from the bog and put on display in a museum. On Wilkinson's perspective, you could be wronged by that happening to you. Your rights can even be violated, despite the fact you've been dead for over 2,000 years. So I think even if we're tempted by Wilkinson's account of posthumous harm, what this implies for justice in public commemoration is complex. For a start, it would greatly increase the number of people who have claims to commemoration. Wilkinson does not think that the strength of claims of the dead decline over time, and there's no obvious mechanism within his account which will allow a rate of decline to be added to it. This means that even people who lived a very long time ago, think about, say, Queen Boudica, 2,000 years ago, would have a stronger claim to be wronged by a failure of adequate commemoration as those perhaps who fought in the Battle of Britain. In addition, there'll be dead people who will be able to be harmed as well as benefited by any particular commemoration. For example, even if Edward Colston was benefited by a statue and a set of rituals, such as Colston Day in Bristol when it was celebrated, there are surely many other dead people who would be harmed, such as though he enslaved or whose posthumous interests were set back by Colston being celebrated in that kind of way after his death. So all this is to say that if Wilkinson is right that we can be kind of benefited or harmed after our death, it just makes the problem of justice in public commemoration massively more difficult. It makes the problem of the scarcity of public commemoration significantly worse, as we've multiplied by many times the numbers of potential candidates for public commemoration, while not increasing the public space or time or resources that we could devote to it. So we can distinguish between backwards-looking and present or future elements of remembrance. So that's to say, between purposes of remembrance which are devoted to bringing to mind the past as past, and those which aim to rework or reaffirm what a community is now and what it stands for through a ritualization of past events. Even if we're focusing only on the purely backwards-looking elements of remembrance, I don't think it's plausible to claim that insofar as somebody once did something notable while they're alive, that person is now and will always be worthy of commemoration. For example, it would seem odd to claim that where there are people whose deeds have been simply forgotten through the passage of time, that these individuals are themselves wronged or harmed, even if those individuals would, while alive, dearly have liked to have been remembered forever. I think it's just going to happen to all of us eventually, and there simply won't be anybody still alive who remembers us or cares about us, and none of us are wronged by that happening, although we may be sad when it occurs. So I guess one part of my answer to the question of, well, who should we remember and for how long, is that even if we do believe in the possibility of posthumous harm, there can be duties to commemorate past lives only insofar as people alive now see something worth commemorating in those who are dead. I think it's even less clear that the interests of the dead should carry much weight when it comes to the present and forward-looking elements of public commemoration. That is to say, when public commemoration is used as a way of affirming who we now are as a community and what we see as our future direction. To take one example, the coming of multiculturalism in Britain was resisted by many during their lifetimes. Should it count for anything now in how we think about our community that there were many people who are now dead who wanted to keep Britain white, for example? Even if we do think that posthumous harm is possible, the political views and interests of the dead should not be given any weight merely as such, regardless of whether we agree with those views or abhor them. The freedom and responsibility that comes with having a democracy in the first place is to build upon, to learn from those that came before, and in the context of what's important to us now. A democracy's goals must, as a matter of principle, remain open-ended and subject to public debate. Of course, going back to past views may alert us to values that we've missed or allow to become covered over, and might be helpful for our current situation. But that's just a way of saying that it's the cogency of the values or worldview that we're responding to, rather than the mere fact that some individuals once held those values. In short, even if we're tempted by the idea that posthumous harms, wrongs and benefits can occur, we should not think of the dead as direct stakeholders of our decision-making processes about public commemoration. We should not take an uncritical attitude towards the interests of the dead. It's we now living who must decide what to publicly celebrate and commemorate and what to allow to go silent, out of the very many potential worthy candidates on the basis of our interpretation of how best to take forward our community's story. To the extent that we view public commemoration as having a present or a future-oriented purpose, the focus should be on how we who are now living want to think about commemoration. So, we can distinguish between direct stakeholders for a particular public commemoration or those other people who are not direct stakeholders who might nonetheless want to comment on it. I hope the broad idea of a stakeholder is familiar enough. You've probably particularly heard about it in the context of politics. So that the idea is that they're people who have a particular stake in a decision. So think about decisions taken by Camden Council. There's a sense in which people who are residents of Camden are stakeholders of that decision in a way that people who live in Aberdeen or France are not. So the questions for us is, well, who out of those people who are currently living has a direct stake in who and what a particular community should commemorate? For example, is it only a predefined group of people, citizens of that country or people who meet some kind of membership requirement? Or should we think about those who are direct stakeholders of the commemoration being a broader group, for example, those people who are particularly causally entangled in the events that are being commemorated? So here's a schematic example which I think helps to highlight some of the examples. I called this figure Barton Bendish. For those who know a lot about Norfolk, it's a small village in Norfolk. I always thought he'd make a very good name for a detective, or something like that, but I repurposed him as a colonial figure. So let's say that Barton Bendish was a 19th century colonial adventurer who generated a vast fortune in several different colonial territories through a combination of skillful deal-making and ruthless and often violent exploitation. Later in life, he returned to his home country and used his wealth to do good deeds in his local community. Bendish is now seen much more favourably in his hometown and in his home country more broadly than in those former countries in which he operated. How, if at all, should Bendish be publicly commemorated? So I take it there are a number of real-world cases that we could point to that are pretty broadly similar to that of Bendish, but I thought it would be helpful to keep it schematic and fictional in order to avoid being sort of dragged into disputes about particular historical figures. Obviously, if it's only a confined group of people, for example, the citizens of the town where Bendish did his charitable works, or Bendish's home country, whose voices and interests matter for how he should be publicly commemorated, then we'd like to see a rather different result than if those from the former colonies are also included. I think we can helpfully distinguish two different kinds of approach to deciding on this question, which we can call event-focused and commemorator-focused. Event-focused approaches will focus on the fittingness of the commemoration, whether it's appropriate to commemorate this individual or event in a particular way, given the other potential candidates for commemoration. For example, it could be argued that a particular public remembrance ritual is not emotionally apt because the historical individual did not in fact have the qualities that are attributed to them. For example, celebrating someone as a hero if he was in fact self-serving, cruel and manipulative. Now, in an untempered form, an event-focused approach may lead us to assume that what should be commemorated and how things should be commemorated should be determined from an entirely impartial perspective, thereby not giving any particular weight to the history, interests and autonomy of the community doing the commemorating. Commemorator-focused approaches start from the perspective of those doing the commemorating and emphasise questions of history, legitimacy and voice. according to such views, it's for a relevant community to deliberate what and who they want to commemorate using and what they want to devote their resources of their community to commemorating. And on these sorts of views, even if an outsider disapproves of their choices, this is not necessarily something the community needs to take into account, unless the reasons advanced are ones that make sense from their perspective. What we should retain, I think, from event-focused approaches is that there are normative standards that apply to commemoration. It should not just be a matter of power or simple majority rule in determining what it is that's commemorated. However, the idea that the makeup of the community doing the commemorating should make a difference also seems rather compelling. For example, it would be very implausible to think that public commemoration should track some objective measure of worthiness to be commemorated. The idea that there should be some centralised list or ranking of how worthy of commemoration particular events or individuals are, and that public resources should be devoted only to those at the top of the list seems absurd. And I think in working out how to balance and reconcile event and commemorator-focused approaches on commemoration, it's also useful to distinguish harm from offence. Joel Feinberg argues that harm should be defined in terms of a setback to interest, and argues that the state should be interested in using the force of the criminal law to punish only those harms that are setbacks to interests and also violate people's rights. Feinberg defines offence in a rather broad sense to cover the whole miscellany of universally disliked mental states, including passing annoyance, disappointment, disgust, embarrassment, and various other disliked conditions such as fear, anxiety, and minor aches and pains. And he suggests that these disliked mental states are not in themselves necessarily harmful, and that offence is surely a less serious thing than harm. And Feinberg also makes a further helpful distinction between ordinary offence, such as your neighbour playing loud music late at night, and profound offence. And the key difference would be that profound offence is an offence to one's moral sensibilities, and is offensive even when you don't witness it. And so the kind of offence that's caused by some cases of inappropriate commemoration would seem to be profound offence, as it not only touches on our moral sensibilities, but something that people are angry about or think is wrong even when they don't experience it themselves. The mere fact that it's occurring somewhere in the world is enough to make them think that a wrong has occurred. I think that the distinction between harm and profound offence is important, as there are contexts in which liberal societies are typically willing to risk or even allow the certainty of profound offence, but nonetheless not stop it. For example, think about the display of artworks that are deemed by some people to be obscene or blasphemous. So even if a particular public commemoration or refusal to publicly commemorate something does cause profound offence, perhaps it's too hasty to assume that it will be therefore unjust or unfair to allow it to go ahead. So I think the one important question for us to do in trying to tease out how to think about particular commemorations and objections to them is to work out, well, what's the nature of the objection to that commemoration? Is it one that there's a wrong or harm taking place? Is it a matter of profound offence? And I think that lack of clarity about whether the objection is really one of offence or harm, I think makes it much more difficult to assess and attempt to reconcile competing claims in practice. So if we put the distinction between direct and non-direct stakeholders and between harm and profound offence together, I think that this gives us sort of four kinds of categories. First of all, we could think about the objection that the commemoration would harm or otherwise significantly wrong someone who's a direct stakeholder in a community, or that the commemoration would harm or otherwise wrong somebody who's not a direct stakeholder. Third, the commemoration could cause profound offence to someone who's a direct stakeholder within the community. And fourth, that the commemoration could cause profound offence to people who are not direct stakeholders, not people who are part of the decision-making process. And I think my suggestion would be that we should give more weight to complaints of harms or wrongs that affect direct stakeholders than those that do not when we're thinking about questions of justice and commemoration. And second, that we should give more weight to complaints of harms or other significant wrong than to those of offence, even when that is profound offence. I guess one question is, well, does that mean that if continuing to publicly celebrate Bendish's life in his hometown would cause profound offence or even harm to those in the colonies in which he operated, then this would be outweighed by the interests of the direct stakeholders in his town? I'm going to say no, and for three reasons. First, as communities become more diverse and they encompass members with a wider range of interests, heritage, and ethnicities, the boundaries between what counts as a direct harm or wrong to stakeholders and what counts as a harm or wrong to others will shift. Thus, if it's citizenship of a country that makes an individual a direct stakeholder in public commemoration, then as citizenship changes through immigration, so does the range of considerations that may be deemed to cause a direct harm. Second, there's something obviously artificial and ethically questionable about drawing boundaries about who counts as a stakeholder that are very different from the causally entangled nature of the events being commemorated. It may be arbitrary to think of the stakeholders for how Bendish should be publicly remembered as residing only in the country in which he spent his money, rather than those countries from which he extracted it. And I think, third, where the event that's being commemorated involves severe assaults on people's identities as identities, then anyone who has that particular identity may consider themselves quite legitimately to be a direct stakeholder for how it's commemorated. Certainly in cases of genocide, this seems overwhelmingly plausible. So to bring everything together, I've sort of thrown a lot at you, and there've been quite a lot of moving pieces. So I've suggested that public remembrance poses problems of justice because public remembrance is a scarce resource, and we also disagree about who and what to commemorate. I've also suggested that public remembrance inevitably has very different goals from history. Public remembrance by its nature presents narratives about who a community is now and wants to be in the future, as well as merely recalling the past as past. Now, whether public remembrance should attempt to do justice to those outside the community doing the public remembrance raises fundamental questions about what public remembrance is for. To the extent that we think that public remembrance legitimately concerns processes of self-formation and self-definition within a community may be selective in what it chooses for commemoration and the stories told within this commemoration, without those who are outsiders of the community having a legitimate complaint. Nonetheless, within multicultural and diverse societies, the range of interests and concerns represented by direct stakeholders to whom public remembrance needs to be accountable is very broad indeed. So clarifying what we take the purpose of public remembrance to be, the kinds of ways that both decisions to publicly commemorate raise questions of justice, the kinds of harms, wrongs and offence that may be involved both in decisions to publicly commemorate and decisions to refuse to do so, would go some way towards making disputes that look intractable appear less intractable. I think it's important not to be unrealistically optimistic, though. Even if all parties are careful, accurate and nuanced in their claim, it may still be the case that there are groups of stakeholders who sincerely take a particular figure to be a hero who is worthy of public commemoration, while others take the same figure to be an architect of such grave moral wrongs that it would be morally tainting to celebrate them. And I acknowledge that there may be such cases where both those in favour and those against can point to a solid body of evidence. I think in such cases there may be genuine and profound offence, perhaps even harm, posed to different groups among the stakeholders, both by the decision to continue publicly commemorating such a figure and the decision to stop doing so. I think in such cases the best we can do is to recognise that public remembrance within a multicultural liberal society is a problem of justice among stakeholders who are each other's moral equals, but have deep differences in how they see the world. And what's perhaps required is to seek creative compromises that will allow us a new way of reaffirming shared values in a more inclusive way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for such a wonderful talk. So I just have a very basic question about the nature of the goods that are being promoted through remembrance and decisions about remembrance. So earlier in the talk, you said that, there seems to be something comparable to the goods which are provided to a community through acts of remembrance and the things that we might want to distribute, or regulate through a principle of justice. Those are like, within the language of liberal political philosophy, things like self-respect, welfare, health, basic rights. But the examples that you gave sometimes at the start of the talk were about emotion. And then now, there's one way of thinking about the goods in question, that they're emotional goods. There's another way of thinking that they're concrete things. They're like statues, So you might think, okay, no, you get the relevant statues in place and people are more likely to experience the relevant emotions. So I'm just wondering, is it just that, these relevant things and potentially the, emotions linked with self-respect, and that they're sort of embedded in particular objects in public places. And so we put the right objects in place, then people are more likely to get the relevant emotions. So what comes first in the theory? That's the question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think I was more interested in active cases, maybe like the remembrance service or something of that sort, where people together do something at a particular time. Because I mean, one of the challenges with putting a statue up is it can just get forgotten. As a way, it may sort of erecting it and sort of getting people to give speeches around it and go around it may serve a ritual purpose at the beginning, but there's so many statues in London and elsewhere that put up sort of a couple hundred years ago. People have no idea who the person is, and so I don't think we can. Even though they may played a particular sort of ritual role within public discourse at the time, they may have stopped doing so. So it's particularly the emotional aspect of it, and particularly the way that emotional aspect is kind of presented and enacted through kind of rituals that involve multiple people and on special occasions.
So is it things like public holidays and like choices for when we have ceremonies and that sort of thing?
Yeah. So something like sort of Martin Luther King Day, perhaps, or Independence Day, or other whether state holidays, or where the reason why there's either a public celebration or public commemoration is related to a particular story within the nation's history.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Hi, thanks, James. Thanks for this talk. It was very interesting. I just wanted to circle back to a point you made on one of your earlier slides to do with a sort of procedural resolution for the kind of conflicts among stakeholders. And I just wanted to know how you see that procedure in terms of, like, do you see that in terms of a kind of balancing of the different harms and the sort of degrees of profound offense, or in some other way? And I'll just make a suggestion, because it seems like some of the ways in which we have these ritualized remembrances involves the state in kind of questions of establishment in similar ways to the way states might have to have a separation with religious groups and other symbolic or expressive messaging. So I just wanted to know if there was a space in the procedural account for something like that.
I think so. There may be two sets of questions here, and I thank you for pressing me on that. There's a question about sort of enacting new rituals, and sort of, well, as you say, is that sort of roughly similar to establishing a state religion? It's certainly, I think you're right that insofar as you want to use symbolic power or coerce, or use the power of the state to encourage people to undertake a certain activity which has a symbolic kind of meaning for that, and the sort of enforcement and the emotional side of that is publicly policed in certain ways. It looks kind of similar to decisions to set up to establish a church. So I think yes, I would agree with you on the first part. I think the second part is so the situation we're in, which I was trying to sort of unpack and discuss, is cases where it looks like we have certain remembrance activities which are sort of already established in a certain kind of way. But then it looks like as society has kind of shifted, become more diverse in certain sorts of ways, it's not clear that you do it in that way now. But nonetheless, an activity is ritualized, and whether it's the same sort of question as, well, do we need to, in the same ways you might think, well, maybe we should disestablish the Church of England, whether in fact maybe one of the kind of responses that somebody might have to some of the intractable questions I'm getting towards in the end is that maybe public remembrance is perhaps not such a good idea after all. If it looks difficult to do it in a way that's kind of fully honest, should we perhaps put less weight on it? I mean, that wasn't what I argued for, but it might be something that somebody took away from it.
So I might have just expressed this maybe not so clearly. When I said establishment, I kind of meant not just like a new movement or a new religion. I sort of meant in the sense that connects to what you said about harm, because presumably giving an endorsement of something, even as an existing ritual, it still kind of makes a statement to others that might lower their sort of social standing because they're not getting the same recognition in the distributive sense from the state.
Yeah. So I think you're right. In some ways, sort of a decision to establish a particular religion as a state religion, it poses some of the sorts of questions about sort of making special and demoting other religions by comparison to it, which is in exactly the same sort of way that I suggested certain forms of kind of ritualized remembrance might do. If the state decides that there's 2 or 3 things that it wants to go big on remembering and making public holidays, expecting people to take part in those rituals, then other sort of other events which are not ritualized in that way might appear to be demoted in an analogous way to the case of the religions that are left the same after a new religion is established as a state religion.
I do have questions, but I'll restrict myself to one. So very, very interesting. Raising a whole lot of issues there, I think, that haven't been discussed. One thing that struck me is whether there's an implicit distinction you're relying on between people having interests as the individual they are and people having interests as a member of a group. Because it feels to me that towards the end, the group identity becomes much more important. And that seems to me right, because it connects with things I've been thinking about in relation to the book City of Equals that I wrote with Evelyn de Chailly. And one of the things that we're interested in is whether people think that we say city, but it could be society. Is your society proud of people like you? Mm. And what could be better than a public commemoration of some sort? And also, if the wrong people are commemorated, that could be a way of showing they're not proud or not proud enough of people like you. So I think that the notion of belonging, how commemoration and belonging, particularly in a multicultural society, is a very useful line for you.
Yeah, definitely. It's exactly. I guess maybe. In some ways, this paper is a way of getting at a set of problems I know you've been thinking about for many years. It seems that, one way of understanding kind of what the crisis in kind of Western democracy has been about, sort of the inability to generate a properly inclusive sense of belonging, and people sort of only being able to latch on to forms of belonging that become kind of exclusive and antagonistic, and that maybe one of the reasons why I'm so interested in the idea of public ritual or public remembrance is it looks like the sort of thing that when it goes well might create a sense of belonging, which might allow people to reconnect with the state and with their fellow citizens in a certain kind of way. But one of the difficulties is you realise that it's at the same time it can become kind of exclusive, and there's a question about how do you sort of define the belonging in a way so that everybody's allowed to belong. In some ways it's exactly the question you're interested in City of Equals, but yes.
I think a quick follow-up, whether that actually frames it as a question of justice or a question of something else. So you might think it could it be a question of what a good society is rather than a just society?
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair challenge. I think that maybe where this particular paper started from was a realization that like it or not, we're in a situation where there's a great deal of antagonism, maybe related to the culture wars, and a lot of that comes down to questions of sort of who and what we remember, how we understand belonging, and it's we're in a position where well, the thought was that if it's true that that there's only a certain number of sort of events that the state can publicly celebrate, and also there's quite a lot of disagreement about what those are, and there's a degree of antagonism. It looks like we're sort of in the circumstances of justice, even if even if there might be other ways of where we might want to be able to think about an issue like this in terms of belonging or a good society. If we're in a position where things are antagonistic and we need to find a way of fairly reconciling claims, so in a way that ideally, we'd be able to kind of do it in a less antagonistic way, but sort of almost one of the reasons why I become so interested in the topic is it seems that the very mechanisms by which societies for hundreds of years have created belonging are now creating kind of outsiders and antagonism.
Very good, thanks, Jack.
Hi, thank you very much. Yeah, it's interesting to think about this issue in terms of justice and ethics. Just wonder what your thoughts are on. I think a lot of historically public commemoration has often been used to reinforce certain narratives, and it's linked to power and who's in power and the majority and all the rest of it. So in terms of accuracy, in terms of I mean, I know that's a complicated thing, but in terms of like looking at a historical figure, like you said, that potentially, say, someone who was a slave owner who then, donated money to found, the Tate Britain or whatever. So, in terms of, being able to present an accurate vision of that, as complex as it may be, of that individual or that period in history, that's kind of very important, isn't it, to actually try to get to the facts. So you made the point about in that particular village, people may just wish to commemorate that individual for the good that he did in that village. But if you're then kind of setting aside maybe how he came to his wealth, isn't that, I don't know, there's something about the kind of narratives that are reinforced, and something about, does justice not then necessitate not necessarily ignoring the good that the person did, but also having a whole picture, to kind of reflect all of that complexity?
No, I think you're completely right. And ideally, I think that would be exactly what we should do. But maybe I'm just not really sure I have enough faith in our process of public remembrance to allow that kind of nuance. I mean, some of the things that I was sort of saying towards the end of the paper, in a way, there's a reflection on how British people think about Churchill. Or, it's kind of, there's sort of oddness of a realization just how two very sort of polarized. For many people, he's the greatest Briton who ever lived. And you talk to other people, and they find it difficult to get past the Bengal famine and various other sorts of things. So if we could get to a stage where you realise that where somebody could have done extraordinarily good things and also extraordinarily bad things, and you might want to sort of, in a way, sort of whether kind of celebrate somebody in a much more nuanced way, warts and all with their flaws. I think we certainly could do that in remembrance. It's sort of but maybe some of the ways in which kind of the mechanisms that set up, it's sort of it's maybe quite difficult to hang on to that nuance. You can do it maybe in history writing, but there's something about the very practices of kind of ritualized remembrance which tend to winnow out a lot of that nuance.
I mean, I've just thought of an example. I mean, there was a time when you'd have the World War II remembrances, there'd be certain battalions or things that were recognized, but increasingly in recent years there's been a recognition there were lots of African troops or troops from the colonies, India, Pakistan, all the rest of it, and those are better represented now. So you're still remembering the people that lay their lives in World War II, whatever, but it's actually more inclusive and more historically accurate. So it's not necessarily one or the other, but it's about like you say, the nuance, or just being more accurate, really, to better reflect what actually happened.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I accept that.
Thank you. It's a really interesting talk. My question sort of leads on from the last one. So through my work, I spent quite a lot of time in a town in Upper Austria called Braunau, which, if you know anything about Braunau, it's the birthplace of Adolf Hitler. And there's for many years, been a very sort of pitched and emotional debate about what to do with his birthplace. Whether there's a physical commemoration to the victims of the Holocaust outside of his birthplace, and it's also a site of pilgrimage for neo-Nazis. So there's this strange way that justice, or like memory justice, functions in Braunau, where you have so many of these sort of stakeholders, as you put them, of obviously physically the direct stakeholders that were affected by his actions aren't there anymore. But there are people that either want to commemorate that physically or to pull down the building. And in the sort of context, sorry, I'm going on, but in the context of Austria, remembrance is not as simple as remembering or not remembering. The blinkeredness is an action, and silence, I mean, as it is everywhere, but it's particularly present there. Silence is a deliberate choice that has been made and has reconfigured a new sort of dominant narrative that's sort of starting to be challenged. I suppose the question that I wanted to bring was how to balance those competing questions of whether something should be there at all, whether remembering something or sort of commemorating something in a sort of physical sense could have unintended consequences, such as sort of every year someone's arrested for being outside of the house on his birthday in sort of regalia, and sort of what happens when commemoration goes wrong in that way.
Oh, it's a really interesting set of questions. Thank you for telling me about all that. So I think maybe one thing that we can take away from what you say is that I was particularly interested in things that the state does in terms of remembrance activity. But if you like, what sort of happened there is more that people are aware that there's a certain place that they could make sacred in a certain kind of way, and they want to sort of get close to Hitler in certain sorts of ways. And so it becomes, as you say, a site of a pilgrimage. They're almost sort of doing the ritualization themselves. And so that maybe one way of thinking through that question is sort of are there things that the state can and should do to almost sort of avoid people kind of ritualizing spaces in certain sorts of ways? And I guess I'm inclined to say yes in cases of that sort. I mean, whether maybe there's an empirical question about if you just to take away the placard or the building where it was born, do people go elsewhere? But in general, insofar as there's been a genocide, then people want to commemorate, to sort of take strength from the person who was responsible for it. It seems not that difficult for the state to say, well, we don't want to allow that sort of ritualization to occur. So that's maybe a partial response to what was a very rich question.
First of all, thank you very much for the lecture. I have a question about cases where two parties have competing claims over the question of who to remember. So in many areas of justice distribution, philosophers have a strong intuition that you should take a lottery, make a lottery between two different parties. So I was wondering whether you think this is a possibility, and if not, maybe this is challenges the very strong intuition that it is always morally preferable to make a lottery whenever such cases arises.
I think that maybe one reason that makes kind of lotteries look plausible in certain contexts in philosophy is that the goods are indivisible. So there's a good that we have to give it to one person rather than another. But I think that maybe one thing that we can do in the case of state support for rituals is that you could effectively say, well, we'll support this one sort of every other year or something of that sort, or to give a bit less state support but to more kind of rituals. And so there's ways of sort of attempting to accommodate the fact that there seem to be a variety of claims in play, and we aren't quite sure how to judge between them. Lottery would be one way, but I think it'd be weird to kind of have a kind of public remembrance lottery. It would seem in rather poor taste, I'd imagine. But there may be ways of doing a similar role that people want lotteries for, i.e., when we aren't quite sure, when our procedures don't tell us who has the strongest claim, sort of attempting to fairly distribute the resources that we do have.
Thank you. My question is, in terms of public remembrance and commemoration, sort of reaffirming or reiterating certain shared values, how do we make sense of what those what values are important to us or what matters to us at the end of the day, and what values are worth promoting?
It's a good question and a hard one. I mean, there's a question about how we do that in our own lives. I mean, it's not an easy question to answer in your own life, where you might think, well, what do I really want out of life? What's actually really important for me? How important is it sometimes for me to speak the truth if that leads me to losing a job or an opportunity? So that kind of question arises, and it's very difficult at a personal level. But I mean, at a level of a state, especially maybe it's partly what we look to political leaders to do, to almost to provide a way of giving us a story about who we've been and who we could be in a way that recognisably takes forward the project that we've all taken part in. And I think it's extremely difficult for political leaders to do it. You look maybe sort of, someone like Obama on a good day in his speeches were able to articulate that in a certain way that made sense. But it's not particularly an easy thing to do. But that, I mean, in many ways, looking for that kind of narrative is crucial to political leadership. It's an important part of remembrance, and that I think that whether or not a way of kind of articulating who we are is an improvement or a worsening, I mean it's always going to be subject to some kind of disagreement. Insofar as that even a great kind of opening up. I mean, I think an interesting example might be the Olympic opening stadium, the Olympic opening ceremony in 2012, where it sort of thought, well, people tried really hard to think, well, how do we find 2 hours which somehow sum up everything we like about being British at the time? And Danny Boyle did a pretty good job, but nonetheless, there's still some people who didn't like it. They thought it was trite, it was ridiculous. But one of the things they did there was just try to find a way of reflecting on the pluralism of what Britain was, the different kind of stories, the strands. So there was something for everybody to celebrate about it. So I mean that's one way of doing it a bit. But insofar as what you're saying was this country or this community stands for this and not that, it's nearly always going to be the case that some people are going to disagree with you. But there may nonetheless be a sort of a majority or the account you can tell about why it is that this is the future of our society may nonetheless be compelling. I hope that answers your question.
Well, I'm afraid we need to leave it there. Thank you very much to all of you for your participation, and thank you, James, for a fascinating talk.
Thank you.